And for those of you who may not know, I'm Maria Maston. I'm the concrete engineer, and I would say I was probably one of the more eager ones when all of this started, and I got myself wrangled into many parts of AASHTO, which are definitely a challenge, but I'm going to be working for 20 more years and living with this, and so it's pretty important to me for us to get it right, along with many others who have been involved from the beginning. So Rachel and I are going to talk a little bit about joint responsibilities of materials and construction for materials acceptance. And not necessarily that we're going to get into detail, but we're going to kind of I'm going to give you the big picture of everything that you've heard and need to think about as we continue to move forward in the scope of everything. So I know you can't see the detail on this slide, but this was actually created by Dave Johnson, the retired project manager, back in 2017. And this was a map of all of the different aspects that needed to be built in order for us to use the construction of materials functionality within AASHTO. And as you say and go through all of that, I want to point out that this box right here is what construction is using right now. So of all the power and functionality, and this isn't even inclusive of everything within AASHTO, this is how much MnDOT is actually using right now with the power and functionality. I did not include a few of the things with the labs, but we will talk about that. To take a closer up picture, excuse me, Jenny and Jessica demonstrated yesterday the type of functionality that construction is using related to daily work reports and contracts, contract items and everything. In that construction box, there were two items that we've talked about the last few days: acceptance records and material sets. And that's what Rachel's going to talk more about at the end of the presentation. So even in that box, there's still a few features that construction can't use yet because they have to be built. All right, so as I move across that big chart, the first box that we hit is materials. And just to kind of summarize what Alan had talked about, all of the materials being built in AASHTO are going to be based on the spec book. And so the spec numbers are considered a material code. So if you know the name of the material or the code, I put the examples that Alan used today: 3101 type 1 for that type 1 cement, 3113 for the type A water reducer. So the system's going to allow you to type in and hopefully filter out the materials based on one part of information that you know. Now, who are the owners of these materials? The materials are owned by several different people: specialty offices, approved qualified products and spec owners, and construction. To give you an idea of the scope of everything, in LIMS there were 80 materials that were developed and were being used. In AASHTO right now, in production, there's over 3,600 materials. Now, estimation is also using AASHTO, and 90% of the materials that are in AASHTO currently are estimation materials. From the lab perspective, right now we only have 360 materials in AASHTO. We anticipate through all of this that there's probably going to be another 50 to 100 materials added by the labs as we continue to go through the implementation and data population. And we expect, based upon almost 2 years ago now, working with Steve Kradowski and Al Setchram and others from construction, that there's another 150 to 200 materials that construction uses and accepts in the field, many even by visual inspection, that all are going to have to be incorporated into AASHTO. Moving along on that big chart, the reference specifications is the next category. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, that the global specs and special provisions, those that are in the spec book, or concrete pavement, I have a special provision, those are going to be maintained by the materials and the spec owners. So we will build those into AASHTO and they will be available for use. Now, if there is a project-specific special provision, that is going to be maintained by construction for each project. So who is going to have that role? That is going to be determined as we figure everything out. But those are built in for individual projects. Action relationships are what ties specs to materials. And action relationships and reference specifications are pretty complicated to build and maintain in AASHTOWare. So I think that even as we've gone through what we went through, we have had to be very thoughtful in the choices that we're making and how we are determining what we want and what we need. And to give you an idea of the scope, right now we showed you we're using cements, cementitious materials, admixtures, curing compounds are primarily the three materials we're testing in AASHTOWare right now. And there's 246 reference specifications and 378 action relationships. It's a very small window of all the materials that I talked about still have to go into AASHTOWare. Oh, I didn't advance. Hold on. All right, next, moving along the line are the test methods. I affectionately equate test methods and agency views. Test methods are containers to hold agency views where testing data is entered. And Alan 100% absolutely showed you agency views today that have associated test methods. Within test methods is billing. Dina talked about how that was a dramatic change with LIMS Lab Vantage, was billing. And that's one of the first things we had to figure out with AASHTOWare is how we're going to tie billing to the test methods to the system so we can continue to bill local agencies and others when we do testing. Current efforts, Karen's talked about this, the group's kind of alluded to it. We've been focusing our efforts on the laboratory test methods to replace Lab Vantage LIMS. Scope, the number of test methods in phase 1 and 2, there were approximately 50. They're anticipating, I think they said 39 yesterday, approximately 40 more agency views. And we don't have a set number on phases 4 to 6 or even any of the field test methods that are still going to need to be developed. So we have ideas, we have lists, we don't have anything that has been completely firmed up and defined. Once again, to give you a scope, currently in AASHTOWare production, there are 69 test methods that are in existence. Qualifications. They talked a little bit about that yesterday. AASHTOWare connects person to sampling and testing qualifications. There are 3 qualification types. The Tech Cert qualification, and that's imported into AASHTOWare from the Salesforce software. And so it's a clean import that we as the users won't even notice, but it's going to happen in the background. The second qualification is provisional qualifications. Those qualifications are determined by the independent assurance and that they will be going into AASHTOWare and assigning whatever provisional qualifications a person has in the system. And the third qualification type is training. That's determined by the districts and the Maplewood Lab. Alan showed you some of the different qualifications that we have set up to even perform the cement testing and those things as he went through things. Each test method requires some type of qualifications. So very important, Alan showed you when he made those sample records that he copied sample records without putting Mike Daniels' name in because that's tied to the material and everything's tied to something. So it's all very thoughtfully put out as when we make our decisions. As far as qualifications go, currently in AASHTOWare production, there are 59 different types of qualifications. Moving on to labs, all sample records and test methods are associated to labs. Right now, there's 5 different types of labs built into AASHTOWare: district materials labs, independent assurance labs, the Maplewood labs, and the several associating under them, a construction lab, and then contractor labs, which our goal, Greg Johnson and mine, one of our big goals is to get the contractor to be putting data into AASHTOWare also. But that's pretty far out on the horizon right now. So all of these labs currently in AASHTOWare production, there are 45 labs in AASHTOWare. And then moving on to sources. So as we complete that circle of that big chart, there are sources and facilities. MnDOT decided very early on that we aren't going to use facilities, that everything is going to be considered a source. And one part of being set up with an AASHTO, and Alan was showing you these sorts of things, only materials produced at a source are associated. So you're only going to see, if you pick that admixture, you're only going to see the sources that have that type of admixture on your list. So there is some filtering within the system. As I said, only materials produced at the source are associated, our sources. We have approved products list, qualified products, aggregates, mixed designs. So there's quite a bit of different things. Currently in AASHTO production, there are 19 source types. So we categorize like materials are categorized. We've categorized the different sources. And from that, aggregate sources, admixtures, cementitious, on down the line. We may have more. There's 19 source types. And there are 6,992 sources and counting, because as I said, a lot of the construction materials, some may be a project material, but they may end up being other source types. And so we will be continuing to build all of that out as we go. Mixed designs were talked about. They're going to be accessible in AASHTO. You saw how you'll be able to see things tied and can get to things from the DWR. We want the same functionality at a daily source report level. And then there will be other ways in the system. Your samples, sample records, you're going to tie mixed designs to those too. So mixed designs, like everything else, are integrated in the system. Some testing specifications are also tied to mixed designs. So the biggest thing with all of this is that scope of making sure that we get everything connected so that it can be utilized within the system. And there's a lot of connections that need to be made. Once again, somewhere down on the horizon, Greg Johnson and I hope to have contractor mixed design data entry into AASHTO also. Daily source reports, Rachel just talked a little bit about them and how you can make a sample from them. That actually wasn't possible until, probably a month or two ago to even have that functionality. You had to drill down further in the system. So that was an important feature that MnDOT is very happy has been created. There's similar concept to the DWR, but unfortunately right now, not all of the functionality that a DWR has exists. For a DSR, we hope to get this into future versions of AASHTO, and it is a high priority for MnDOT, but right now our labs are our highest priority. So our priorities, plant inspection and documentation input directly into AASHTO. To have that same diary functionality that a DWR has. There's a lot of checklists that are used and a lot of spreadsheets that we use in our plant monitoring operations, and all those are future hopes for the daily source reports and be able to do things along the lines of source acceptance and things like that. Moving on to sample records. This is the whole, this whole box is what Alan just went through with you, showing you the creation of a sample record and everything that's tied to it, all the way down to the sample record test and authorizing samples and approving them. This is driven by the users, and the data that goes in with the sample record is populated by the users of the system, and the reference data and everything that is going to be built and associated for that user to be able to completely populate and fill out that sample record. And then all of that in a quick whirlwind brings us back to the contract in the construction box. So if you go back to this construction box and remember, there were a few parts that were not set up yet. And those two parts were the material sets and acceptance records. Thinking about this, when you build material sets, basically we have to associate every material and testing rate to a contract item. I didn't list how many contract items there are. Jenny may know something along that line. I did not list that. But if you think about all the items and the pay items, and all of those are going to need to be built out and have material sets assigned to them, acceptance actions, actions, relationships. To quote Al Setchram and Steve Kordosky early on, this is going to be a lot of work. And we're not there yet, but this is where one of the things is going to be critical when we start to bring a few more volunteers in from construction who are going to be able to help us build all of this stuff to make Asheware function as we want it to function. And that last box, acceptance records, I think we talked about this a little earlier with some questions. Global acceptance actions in the schedule materials control, materials, traffic, environmental stewardship, we're hoping to add bridge. All of those will be in Asheware system globally. That'll apply to all projects. Anything that is project specific is going to have to be built by construction. Rachel's going to go into more detail about setting all of these things up. One thing that I want to point out is the way the schedule materials control is written cannot be translated 100% into Asheware. We've got different rates and they do not work in Asheware even if you stack requirements and things of that nature. So we've talked within materials already about getting a group of people together involving construction and materials and looking at the testing rates and looking at the schedule materials control and how we can build it to work for Asheware in the future also, while still meeting the requirements of the FHWA and the number of tests we feel we need in order to be assured of the quality of our materials. In the end, our goal is real-time material acceptance though. And all of these things tied together are going to give us that ability to really have a better handle on materials in the future. And that's all I have. So Rachel, do you want me to stop sharing so you can open yours, or can
Sure.
we give you control of mine? Which would you like?
Go ahead and I'll take over. You don't even have to do anything. I'll just
Okay.
Haha. All right. Yes. So as you saw, there's a lot of reference data that MnDOT has already set up. So the foundation is there leading into setting up your material acceptance requirements in project, but there is a long way to go. And we're going to look at what needs to happen and why and how it can happen. So in project, we refer to material acceptance requirements as something special, which is an acceptance action. And your acceptance actions can be satisfied by 3 different types of records. We've talked about these briefly, but we're going to really dig into it now. So the very first type of record are samples. And this is something that's changed a lot and will be changing a lot moving forward. So in the past, every sample represented 1. So you could have a requirement to run a particular type of test once for every 1,000, and maybe on one sample record, you have that test 3 or 4 times represented. That sample still only counted as 1. In upcoming releases, I believe in 4.5, we're going to start counting each of those tests individually. So one sample can meet the requirement for many tests, and really, so the type of record now will become a sample test. Another type of record is your daily work report acceptance record. And these are really useful for things like your certifications, visual inspections, documenting that something came from an approved product list or a qualified product list, if you want to build that into your requirements, things of that nature. And then if there's something that is maybe a little more detailed, you want to capture a little bit more than just this field inspection value, which is currently what's being matched. Right now we just have it checking to see if the field value is the same as what you say you're looking for. But maybe you want more. In that case, you can use your daily work report acceptance record agency view. And here's where you guys can decide, what is it that we really care about? What do we want to see? Earlier, we looked at that very simple example of a concrete water check. Here we have another simple one, a certification. So here we're just capturing who reviewed the cert, when, does it meet the specifications, and then any additional information you might want to capture. Here we say that the certification was attached. So you can make attachments of photographs or scanned copies of a PDF or something to this record as well. Your acceptance actions get defined with something called rates and frequencies. So this tells you how regularly you want to require that record. Your rate, in this case, we're looking at a rate of 1. And then for frequencies, you're first defining your frequency type. We have 5 different types of frequencies, and we'll look at those in detail. And then the regularity that that frequency needs to happen at. So in this case, we're talking about a frequency type of quantity. So how much of my material was placed, and my action frequency is 100. So all those things together is telling the user, I'm looking for this type of record once per every 100 units of material that gets installed. So that's the very first frequency type, is your quantity frequency type. You also have a contract frequency type. Your contract frequency type, you're typically just going to be looking for something like, I need 1 of these per contract. You can't use it to cross contracts, so you can't say I need 1 per every 5 contracts or anything like that. So it's really just looking for 1 specific record, or maybe you want it more than 1, but it's all contract based. A temporal type is something where you're going to say, I'm looking for something per day, week, month, or year. And that is based on the time that the material got installed. And that's on the daily work report where you've indicated that material was used. So if I have a daily work report with an item posting on May 1st, and I have a requirement that I need 1 per day, I'm going to be looking for that matching record from May 1st. And similarly for the week, month, and year, if I installed on Monday, then I need something somewhere between Monday to Sunday. Source and work location are a little bit different and a little odd. The way that this works is you'll see that you can populate the frequency type of source, and then it shows you another box underneath where you are identifying an ID of the source. Typically, you're going to leave that blank. And what that does is it tells the system, I'm looking for 1 of these anytime that a source is used for a material. So that would be like, I'm looking for a certification for every source. And that way you know that anytime a source is supplying material, that the system will be sure that it's a certified source. If you do populate that field with an ID, you're telling the system, I don't care if the inspector ever says that he used that source, I still want to be sure that I get this record from that source. I think that that is probably primarily useful populated at the contract level when you know that a particular source is going to be providing that material and you don't necessarily trust that your users are going to enter the value of the source that provided that material, and you want to be sure that you're going to get that documentation. Work location is similar. You have the ability to document a work location, a particular one. In this case, we have Centerlane, or you can leave that blank. And again, in the case of leaving it blank, you're saying anytime an inspector documents that material was placed in a particular work location, then I'm going to be looking for an associated record from that work location. If you populate it, then you're saying I have to have a record from that place. So that would be, I think an example that Mike Daniels gave was from the hopper or behind the paver. There are times where you have to take a sample from those types of places. And so you could hard code that requirement into the system. How these work and where we're going with them is that you first define your acceptance requirements globally for all of your materials, no matter where they're used. We have grouped your materials into material categories, and this is important because your category is kind of the parent and all of its children inherit things from it. So a material category can have many materials, and anything that you've populated at the level of the category will be inherited by the child. Not anything, but a lot of things. For example, acceptance actions. Acceptance actions, again, just your material requirement. If you populate one at the level of the material category, then all of the child materials also have to meet that acceptance requirement. So this is nice when you know that all of the children are going to have a particular requirement. You only have to create that record one time and maintain it one time at the level of the category, as opposed to for every material maintaining that record. We've touched on this next concept a little bit, and it's a little in the weeds for what we're talking about right now, but just to give you a sense of the kind of data that we are going to need as we're populating this. In order to let the system know what type of record we're looking for an acceptance action, we associate the acceptance action to something called an action relationship. And what I like to tell people is just to forget the word action altogether, and you can just think of it as acceptance and relationship. Your relationship is the relationship between a material and a material category to some type of document, whether it's to a test, your acceptance record, or your agency view. You're just making that relationship, and you're saying this material can have this test performed. This material could have this particular agency view populated. And then by associating that relationship to an acceptance action on the material or material category, you're saying, I'm going to require that that document gets populated for this material. How does this all tie into items? Your material can be grouped together into something called a material set for a particular item. So you might have a work item that can be either a precast or a cast in place. The materials for a precast item would just be that precast item. The material for a cast in place would be more complicated. You would have concrete and rebar and everything else that goes into it. So you could potentially have both of those material sets associated to that item, and then depending on the contract where you're actually installing the item, you would choose either precast or cast in place. You can also associate those acceptance requirements directly to items so that a particular acceptance requirement is only applicable when it's used on a certain type of work item. This is useful when you have requirements that are more stringent for some types of items than for others. And how this all gets populated onto the contract is that your contract has one or many projects. A project has one or many items. You run this process of generating materials and acceptance actions onto the contract, and it will go take a look at your reference level item, all of the material sets with their materials that you've set up for that reference level item, pull all of that stuff in onto the contract, and all of those acceptance requirements for the material and its parent material category, and populate all of that onto the contract. So now you have specific contract materials and acceptance actions. At that point, you can perform any kind of maintenance that you need. So maybe you need to update some of those base level global requirements. Maybe you have special provisions that you want to add. You can add materials, you can add acceptance actions, you can create brand new material sets. And coming soon, you'll have the ability to delete things completely off. Right now you can turn them on and off, you can't delete them. Yeah. All right, so this is our high level data and their relationships and how it all kind of flows down. And we're going to give you a more concrete example of what this would look like. So my material category that we have set up here is aggregate. And this is very high level and possibly not how MnDOT will have it set up, but go with me on this journey. This material category of aggregate has an acceptance action set up that's requiring 1 sieve test per every 500 tons. I know that no matter what type of child materials are on my job, I'm going to always run this sieve test at minimum that regularly. And then I have 2 materials underneath that aggregate. I have number 57 limestone and I have 3/4 inch limestone. And each of those have specific material specific acceptance requirements. So my number 57 limestone, I am going to require 1 abrasion test per day. And for my 3/4 inch limestone, I'm going to require 1 certification per source. Bringing that all onto my contract, I have an item, my recycled hot mix asphalt, and my item has a material set, which is my asphalt mix set. And then on that set, I have these materials and maybe many more, but at least these materials. When I generate my materials and acceptance requirements onto this contract for this item, my number 57 limestone gets the 1 sieve test per 500 tons, as does the 3/4 inch because it's coming from the material category, so they both get it. But my number 57 gets the abrasion test while my 3/4 inch gets the certification per source because those were set up at the specific material level. And it could get even crazier when you start talking about how you're going to associate some of those specifically to some types of items, but not others. So in that case, you might have these same materials on other work items with a different set of acceptance requirements because it's being used in a different application. So what do we need from construction? We have some remaining tasks that are only going to be done one time during the implementation, which will be identifying material requirements for payment. So that's going through the schedule of materials control, figuring out what your current rates and frequencies are, and translating all of those into project language. As Maria touched on, sometimes your requirements are complex and not necessarily as straightforward as 1 per 500 units. In that case, we're going to have to think of creative ways that we can meet those minimum requirements using system terminology and system functionality. And then another large task will be to associate your materials to items in those sets of materials. The reason that is a complex task is you're not just identifying what materials you use, but you're also identifying how you're going to translate the item unit into the material unit using something called a conversion factor. So this is also something that we've briefly mentioned previously, but if your item unit is a square yard, but the material is measured in cubic yards or tons or bags or gallons, how do you convert that item unit into the number of material units that go into making 1 unit of that item? So that's a large task, again, that will be done once and we'll never have to think about it again, but it will take some thinking. And then moving forward after that's done, every time a new spec book gets released, every time things change, that all needs to be maintained at the global level. And that is something, as Maria said, that Maplewood will be responsible for maintaining globally. But at each contract activation at the level of the contract, there is going to need to be a review of the globals for that particular contract and then any kind of maintenance that needs to be done. So you might need to add or update those project specific requirements. And then throughout the life of the contract, as things change, you may need to turn materials on and off or modify those requirements. So lots of ongoing tasks related to these acceptance actions. And that's all of it for this. And I see that we have questions that were sent in. I imagine we have questions that have not been sent in. People are waiting for me to stop rambling about acceptance requirements.
So I think some of it has to do with acceptance, it looks like. Nice job, ladies. Okay, there are 5 questions out here. Let's go from at the top. And first, there's a comment over in the chat session. Maria Charlie K said, Maria, I happen to be in transport list. It has 7,853 items.
There you go. I don't
There
know
you
how
go.
to say more than that than to say we also have to think about all the items we have.
There you go. That was pretty good. Thank you, Charlie K.
Yes.
Maria.
Thanks for putting that one
Okay.
piece of data I didn't have.
Okay, so we have the first question off the top here. Maria, it's for you. It's from Dave Van Dusen. Maria, you mentioned that special provision language is challenging to implement in AASHTO. As you know, specialized concrete mixes have become much more common, at least in my district. What are your thoughts on strategies or plans to develop AASHTO to handle these situations?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, we have to continue to acknowledge innovation, but we have to think about when we make changes and what impact they're going to have on everything. I think it's going to be really tough in the beginning as we start to work all of these details out, but I think as we start to get used to all of this, a lot of the special concrete mixes don't have additional testing requirements that the construction people are going to see. They might have materials testing requirements, but a lot of the frequencies and testing rates related to acceptance actions and material sets may not be, maybe more hidden to the user, I guess is my way to say it. It may meld in, but it all has to be thoughtfully considered.
Thank you. I'm going to unmute Dave here in case he has any other comments back. Okay. So Dave, I put you as allowed to talk so you can, because you had some other questions down below too. And then while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and unmute Gus as well because he has questions too. So,
can you
okay.
hear me? Hello?
Yes, now I can hear you. Yes. Hello, Dave.
I can't even remember what I asked now.
First is about the special provision language.
And yeah, so I think Maria knows the predicament or situation that we're in Metro. And I was asking questions about plant inspection yesterday, and we've got a pretty old plant inspection database and scheduling software that's built around Microsoft Access that we're phasing out. But we're going to dump a lot of money into this new one, which is based on Salesforce allegedly, and AASHTO is quite a ways down the road, and we're just all cognizant of the fact that AASHTO is coming, hopefully, and we want whatever we're going to invest in Salesforce to be well, to merge into AASHTO, be able to utilize it as much as possible so that we're not spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a antique before it even gets off the ground. But Maria had mentioned, I know the plant inspection portion of it is kind of down the road, but I just wanted to hear from people that are more involved with AASHTO. What is the time frame for implementing a module that our plant inspectors could use when they go to bituminous or ready mix or paving plants to log samples and be part of the process that way? How far down the road is that?
I'm happy to start to answer this question. That is a loaded question. That's how I would start with the
Don't
answer
say
to that.
that.
No, that's okay though. So
Okay.
I think there's different aspects of it. I think that there is the sample record creation and logging in samples that could come much faster than the ability to do a complete inspection at a source the way we do business now. As I said earlier, some of the limitations are due to the fact that they're not set up in AASHTO yet. And, you know, MnDOT has had this list for a couple years, and we have quotes on cost to develop and build it. A lot of these things still go back to, if you go back to Charlie's presentation and talking about TMRs and votes and all of these different things, even though MnDOT may want something, development of a lot of these things still have to occur based upon a consensus. And Infotech or anyone else who wants to add comments to that, or Todd, please feel free to chime into that. So I can't 100% say when the plant inspection timeline will be. I'd like to say that it'll be in 2 years is my hope, because I think that once we get through, my personal opinion again, once we get through a few of these humps with a few more of the phases of the lab implementation, that some focus from some of us can start to go on to the next phase and the construction and the acceptance actions and all of those things while the rest of the lab stuff is built. But that's a much bigger question to answer. So I don't know, Rachel or Gina or Todd, if anyone wants to comment on the functionality within AstroWare. I don't think Charlie's on right now.
Todd's out for a meeting with the commissioner right now too. Unless he's back on, he's there, but I think he's on another meeting too. And Karen and Suzanne, I think, are going to address like timeline and schedule and stuff.
Right, but as far as you know, TMRs and functionality within the system, you know, Charlie talked about it yesterday. I mean, most things, even if MnDOT had a need, it still has to go through a process, correct?
Yes, it depends on the criticality of the need. So if there is something that is preventing MnDOT from going into production, or that is critical to your business, maybe you're already in production and you encounter an issue, a really critical issue, we can typically get something out to you pretty quickly via a patch to an existing version. If it's an enhancement, again, that's something that would maybe be preventing you from being able to go into production, and therefore it's critical, we can typically get enhancements into the next release depending on how large that is. We have moved to a twice-a-year release schedule for our versions, so typically we could get something to you within the year, again, depending on how large it is. But it does go through a process where your enhancements are reviewed by the PTF and by what is called a feature package group to ensure that whatever we're putting into the system is not going to impact or hinder the ability for other agencies to get their needs met as well, and to continue with the processes that they have in place. So there is that level of collaboration that has to happen.
So, and I think that, you know, I think there is functionality within the DSR that can be implemented much sooner than the dream, as I call it, or the vision. You know, I think there's attachments, you know, even though we can't, you know, maybe create diaries in there right now, we can attach diaries so the records will be there. So it's just a matter of working through the process in more detail, which we did early on, then we shifted focus again. So I wish I could give you a better answer, Dave.
No, that helps.
Yeah, and there's also, yes, and there are also some other agencies who are looking into like that different functionality, like with the daily source reports. Now they're really getting an interest in it, so they're looking at those TMRs as well too. So
that Minnesota had submitted priority originally.
Yes.
There are several agencies that are very interested in, you guys were the ones, I think, that submitted the agency views at the level of the daily source report.
Right.
Yeah, so I think there's some other agencies for sure taking a look at that and interested.
Yeah. You guys are some leaders.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, so we have, thank you, Dave. And now we have, Gus has 1, 2, 3 questions here. And then Yosef has one as well. Hi, Yosef. So, Gus, we have a few. I'm just going to go through those in order here.
Sure.
Okay. So your first one is, how will acceptance of material work as it relates to specifications such as density of grading and base material accessed by ordinary compaction?
Accepted.
Accepted. I was wondering, like,
I probably
accepted by
spelt it
ordinary
wrong.
compaction.
So Rachel, I'll fumble through it and then you can clean it up for me. So I think this is what, when Rachel talked about, you know, creating all these global acceptance actions. So the schedule materials control would have something for ordinary compaction and for specified density, I think is the other one it's called.
Right.
And when it gets to the contract level, the contract would have, they could, in the future, Rachel said, delete if a certain item is going to be accepted by ordinary compaction, they could delete the specified density requirement. Is that fair, Rachel?
Yes, right now that is not possible, but what you could do is essentially turn it off just by setting your rates and frequencies to 0, and therefore the system won't enforce that requirement. But in the future, we expect that we'll be able to delete specific ones.
But right now, those adjustments would have to be made at the contract level.
And
Correct?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, and I guess the other question, you know, there are several of those things with some of the new compaction in the bituminous and grading and base. You know, we're using new machine compaction and things like that that they'll have to be incorporated into that, and I don't know how, if it's a matter of adding you know, documentation from the equipment or something like that, but that
And
was
even, oh,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, even all of those special provisions, if they're originating with the specialty offices, we're going to be the ones responsible for building everything to make it available in the system to be applied to contracts. So
Okay. And then the next question, Rachel, can you read that through that?
Sure. In the past, items that were placed in small quantities were recorded and documented on a form. How is that going to be done now?
And the acceptance at the, what is it, 2403 or the 2415?
right. I would say we have not spent much time, since we haven't really delved deeply into acceptance actions, of determining what we're going to do with small quantities. Most small quantities still require some sort of a test. Otherwise, they would be a materials exception, you know, type of a concept. But we have not figured all that out yet, Gus.
Okay.
How would items added via a change order be dealt with? So right now, in terms of system functionality, when you add an item via a change order, just like when you generate the materials and acceptance actions at the beginning of the job, all of those global level settings will be brought over onto the contract. So whatever is set up globally for that item, those material sets, materials, and their associated acceptance actions will come. Gina's raising her hand.
I just want to ask a question for this. Gus, in construction, are you guys using unattached items? I don't think Jenny's on, she's on another call to another meeting too, but she's kind of on the call still, or maybe.
Is Jessica there?
Nicole, Jessica might know if you guys using unattached items. Nicole, Jenny.
I can't answer
Unattached
that
items.
specifically.
Okay, there's another part of it as well.
Unattached
If-
items
if-
for construction, I can
Mhm.
ask Jessica
Mhm.
or Jenny.
Okay.
Is there anyone from construction who might know the answer to that question? I don't know, how can they raise their hand, or they can comment in the chat?
Can we go on to the next question and let
Yeah.
me Skype
Yeah,
Jenny?
yeah. Okay. And it's just simple as that the system will automatically generate those acceptance actions for those unattached items as well. And then on the change order, when the change order is approved, it would generate it again, and any acceptance that would have been made in the interim. For instance, whenever you have an unattached item added to the change order, you're going to know what acceptance actions need to occur. So it'll still record those samples and tests that are performed on it until that change order is actually approved. And then when the change order is approved, then it'll still use those acceptance records to match that up. That was just the last piece of it. Because it's kind of, so you can document in real time when you're doing your testing when those new items are being added to a change order before it's approved. That's a little bit of that great functionality there.
We never do that though.
No,
no.
I'm not recording this. I'm not recording this. Recording button, turn off. What? Okay. Okay. All right. I'm going to, okay, got that one. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Gus, for your question. And Joseph, I have it where you can be unmuted for this one. Do you have a question? What if agency is willing to invest? Can this help to expedite the process? I'm going to unmute you for this. Okay.
I'll take a stab at this one. Yes and no, it depends. If the enhancement or the functionality is not something that is seen as being maybe like a globally useful or universally useful enhancement, maybe it's specific just to one agency, and therefore the PTF has decided that they're not going to select that for inclusion in a particular version, then yeah, absolutely. An agency saying, well, we'll fund it would expedite the process. It would allow that piece of functionality to be developed where it otherwise would not have been. But there's still the normal bureaucracy and process that it will have to go through. So it won't necessarily speed up the time for development, but it would get it into an earlier version than it might otherwise have gotten into.
Rachel, the other thing is it could get added to the ballot, and if you're good at it, you could possibly convince other states that it's something that should be incorporated and do it via the ballot too.
Absolutely, yes, and that's what I was saying. I mean, if other agencies find it useful, typically the PTF will agree to include it in a version. But if you're alone, or if there's just a handful of you, you can choose to fund it yourself and get it in soon.
Right. Yeah. And MnDOT is these priorities, like all the plant stuff, we have put very high on when we vote on the TMRs. However, we say, okay, we look at where MnDOT is at in our development of AASHTOWare. And if we think that last year, we were 2.5 years away from, even implementing plant stuff, but there were other things that we needed more right away, then we had to make judgment on how we voted to prioritize what we needed the most in our own implementation. So.
Okay, thank you.
I did get,
Brad, you mentioned, oh, go ahead.
I did get, this is Nicole, I got an answer from Jenny. It has been mentioned, contract change unit is not been interested in going that route at this time. So we are not using the unattached items and change orders.
Okay, thank you, Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been recorded.
Just repeating the Skype message.
Okay. Okay. So from there, I think that's all of the, is that all the questions? Ah, that was my guess too. Okay, Brad, cool. Okay. All right. Let's see here. There. We have Todd is back on the call again.
Gina, yeah, this is Todd.
Hello. Hi.
I just missed a conversation on, it sounded like you were talking about funding some enhancement. And I don't know
Mhm.
what it is. If you could tell me what, if it is associated to a TMR, we can certainly look into that. Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about the source, daily source report and source kind of inspection and enhancements.
Okay. Well, we can take that offline as a group and talk about that level of importance.
Sounds good.